Mexico's murderous drugs wars have, if it were possible, become even more savage. Over the past 5 years, more than 35,000 people have been killed as drugs cartels battle for a greater share of the multi-billion-dollar US drugs market. Now the gangs even appear to be deliberately targeting children as a way of spreading terror and imposing their rule. I spoke earlier to Bruce Bagley, a key figure from the University of Miami, who studies the workings of these ugly drugs cartels. Is this a really serious new development? The pressure on children, the death of children, is that a new development or an expanded development?
I would call it an expanded development. It flows from the growing competition for the $19 billion or more that we are seeing among the multiple cartels operating in Mexico. It derives from the fact that we've seen a transition from the old way of doing business in Mexico during the 71 years of pre-rule to a new way of doing business that's far more competitive. The bottom line is that as democracy has taken root in Mexico after 2000, the traditional authoritarian forms of governance no longer function. The old agreements with the political establishment of the PRI don't work, and there has been no new agreements put in place. So it's every man against every man, and in this context, children, women, grandmothers, extended families are all prey to the cartels seeking to expand their control over territory, over crossover points into the United States, and to gain a larger share of this incredibly lucrative trade.
And is it in this particular situation, is the violence and the 35,000 deaths we were just talking, murders we were talking about just now, I mean, are these in fact all of them from one particular form of crime, in the sense that ordinary people are not threatened, only people in the drug business, only rival drug gangs get murdered, or does innocent people get murdered as well?
Absolutely. Innocent people are increasingly caught up in the crossfire, if you like, of these murderous cartels who know no limits and abide by no rules. Citizen security or public security in Mexico, especially in the northern parts of the country, in places like Ciudad Juarez, just across the border from El Paso, have become very much part of the ongoing slaughter that is taking place. Indeed, Juarez is one of the most dangerous cities on the planet at this moment, and innocent civilians are killed virtually every day. The violence is spreading from the border to a variety of other points in Mexico, to resort areas, whether Acapulco or Cancun, to mention a couple, to major cities like Chihuahua, Monterrey, Guadalajara. And innocent civilians get caught up all of the time because there are no limits, there are no rules, there's no discrimination on the part of these groups. They use violence and murder as a tactic to intimidate each other. And in that context, children and families are subject to the violence that they wreak. They use the same kind of violence against government officials, military officials, police officials, and their families. And they certainly have begun to target some Americans as well. Government officials, there have been at least 5 Americans killed in the last year in Mexico. So almost no one is safe anymore. And Mexicans feel this. Public opinion polls in Mexico rate public security or citizen security as the #1 security issue in the country.
And who's winning? This last 5 years, President Calderon has tried to bring in new measures and so on, but who's winning? The police, the forces of law, or are all of these drug cartels winning the battle? And when we talk about 35,000 deaths in the last 5 years, how many of those were drug criminals and how many of them were police and ordinary citizens?
Almost 2/3 of the deaths are among criminals themselves or people affiliated with the gangs. The other third are either government officials or innocent bystanders, citizens that have nothing to do with it all. But the number of innocent citizens and the number of government officials being killed is on the rise. Who's winning? That's a major issue, and it really depends on how you define winning. President Calderón militarized this conflict at the outset of his government on December 1st, 2006. And the carnage, the violence has risen every year since then. From the citizens' point of view, it appears that almost no one is winning. From the government's point of view, they believe and they argue that they've made some significant strides. Over half of all of the major capos or drug lords in Mexico on the wanted list at the outset of Calderón's government in December 2006 have now been caught, killed, or jailed or extradited to the United States. That's a pretty good record. But every time a major figure in the drug business is killed, every time a major drug lord is either sidelined or sent out of the country in extradition, it unleashes a new wave of violence among his lieutenants to control. So actually, the progress that Calderón has pointed to has led to higher levels of violence among the remaining cartel members. There are a couple of other indicators of success that I think should be pointed to that are often ignored by the Mexican public and by the world public in general, just witnessing the carnage. President Calderón, through militarization, set out to atomize or fragment or cut down to size these cartels. And in some senses, he has been able to reduce their power. They no longer represent the kind of threat to national security that they did 4 or 5 years ago, and many would consider that a form of success. I do myself. Second of all, President Calderón, in taking the fight to the cartels, has forced some of the major organizations, particularly the Sinaloa cartel of El Chapo Guzman and the Zeta cartel, one of the most brutal of all, run by Mr. Lascano, to take up residence and to begin operations in countries south of Mexico and Central America. So partial success in Mexico can be measured under the Calderón government, but it is a nightmare for Guatemala and Honduras, who are now feeling much of the pressure that has been brought to bear by the United States and by Mexico against these cartels. And frankly, the average Mexican citizen doesn't see the progress on the streets at all. If anything, the situation has become worse as the violence has increased, leading to a great deal of discontent with the heavy militarization that President Calderón has initiated and sustained since the outset of his government.
Yes, and as you say there, that other countries, Ecuador is another one, who fear that if the gangs, the cartels are driven out of the country, that they will find another home. They won't just disappear, or they won't go back to being law-abiding citizens. They might go to Ecuador or one of the other countries you've mentioned, as happened in Colombia a few years ago.
There's no question. Drug criminality was driven out of Colombia. It hasn't gone altogether, but it's certainly been reduced. It went north along the Pacific corridor, up along Central America and into Mexico, which of course is a major border country of the United States, our southern neighbor. Now, with the great pressure being brought by the Merida Initiative, by the U.S. government, and especially by the Calderón government in Mexico, we're seeing this balloon effect take place once again. And another effect, which I call the dispersion of criminality, or the cockroach effect. When you go into a dirty kitchen, snap on the lights, the cockroaches scurry into the neighboring rooms. In this particular country, the pressure is sending them scurrying into other countries. You mentioned Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the countries that is being used by the Colombian organizations and in affiliation with Mexico to bring refined cocaine out of Colombia to the Pacific coast, and then either north to the United States or, by the way, south around the Horn across the Atlantic to West Africa and to Europe. Another country that is being affected increasingly is Venezuela. We're also seeing a reflux back through the Caribbean. Some of this is directed at the US market, but the US market has remained relatively stable at slightly under 6 million cocaine users per year. It's still the largest market in the world without a doubt, and the US has major co-responsibility obligations with regard to Mexico. But increasingly, the Mexican drug lords, in collaboration with some of the Colombians, are using either Ecuadorian or Venezuelan territory or some of the Caribbean islands to ship out illegal cocaine and then cross the Atlantic to West Africa, and then using West African routes into Europe. Across the African continent and the Sahel, across the Mediterranean. There are major entry points in various parts of Europe. So what we have seen is a kind of balloon effect with regard to routes for smuggling and a dispersion of criminality, what I call the cockroach effect, that is spreading criminality around the world. This is not a triumph in the war on drugs. It is actually one of the collateral damages that we should point to in the search for a strategy that works better.
And in terms of a strategy that works better, is there anything in addition to law and order, which is obviously so important, but things like people recommend that if we decriminalise some drugs, that might help solve the problem. Is anything like that any use in this situation, do you think?
Well, it's not going to be a short-term solution, because if decriminalization takes place, it's going to take some years. But I think there are three things that I would highlight. First, better efforts to control demand in the United States, and by the way, in other parts of the world, including Europe, would be, over the medium run, a significant help, because it would reduce demand and hence profitability. Along with that, prison reform and other things. A second area would, of course, be some form of harm reduction that treats drugs not as a criminal problem so much, but rather as a problem of public health. If that involves decriminalization, which would be extremely difficult in the United States, so be it. But it would be more likely that we're going to see some forms of depenalization that reduce, if you like, penalties for people that are caught up simply for use. And a strengthening of institutions is a third area that I would emphasize. Institutions, in Mexico in particular, require strengthening. The inheritance from the authoritarian past has left them with democratic institutions that don't work well. The police, the prison system, the court system, intelligence gathering. And by the way, elections that receive hot money are all part of the problem. Mexico's going to have to direct itself at its own institutions.
Bruce, thank you so much for that splendid survey of the whole situation, the very worrying situation in many ways. And we thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to talking again.
My pleasure, Sir David.
According to some, it's no longer a case of if Greece defaults on its debts, but when. Greece borrowed 110 billion euros from the Eurozone bailout fund, but its debt is 3 times that. If a default, or a restructuring, as it's more kindly called, happens, what happens next? Would Portugal follow suit, and Spain and Ireland? Would it really be such a disaster or not? As we heard earlier, right-wing parties in Europe say no more bailouts. Let these countries sink. Joining me now from Brussels is British Conservative Euro MP Daniel Hannan. Welcome to you, Dan, over there. And here in London, Economist Yeuh from Bloomberg. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you first of all, Daniel. I mean, do you think that the richer countries should go on bailing out the poorer countries in the way we've seen the pattern established? Should there be more bailouts to save more countries, or what?
Well, I'm not sure it is saving them. I mean, you referred to it in the introduction as letting them sink, but what's sinking these countries is membership of the euro. They're not able to devalue, they're not able to price themselves into the market. They were wrecked by having too low an interest rate for too long. They're now getting too high an interest rate for the repayment. You do not help an indebted friend by pressing more high-interest loans on him. This is not about bailing out Greece or Ireland or Portugal, it's about bailing out the euro, because the bailout money is going to go to European bankers and bondholders, but the repayment is going to come from the ordinary taxpayers of those countries.
And so you think it actually is worse to try and help them than not?
As I say, I don't think it is helping them. I think what would help them is being able to suit their monetary policy to their own needs. So we're doing something that is bad for the recipients, bad obviously for the contributors who are trying to make cuts and savings at home, but are finding that all of those savings are being soaked up by these bailouts, and by the way is totally illegal. I mean, the EU treaties don't just not provide a legal basis for these bailouts, they expressly prohibit them. And I don't think you'll find anyone in Brussels who pretends that what we're doing is remotely compatible with the law.
And do you believe that those Eurozone countries who've contributed in this way will ever get their money back?
Well, it's beginning to look as though they won't. I mean, the idea that it was a commercially viable loan was always a rather dodgy one, because if these loans were so commercially viable, they would have been raised on the open market. The reason these countries needed to come to the EU was precisely because they couldn't do that. And as you said in your introduction, it's now becoming pretty clear that Greece is planning to default. Portugal is in the same situation as Greece in the sense that its debt is growing faster than its GDP, which makes a default more or less inevitable. So I don't think we're going to see the money again. But just one point that is worth stressing here. If the Eurozone countries themselves want to dig into their pockets to keep their project afloat, at some cost to their own taxpayer and indeed at some cost to the recipient countries, I think they're making a mistake, but that is their mistake to make. What I think is outrageous is to send the bill to the non-Euro countries, such as Britain and the Eastern European countries. I mean, one of the absurdities of a Portuguese bailout is that under the European Financial Stabilisation Mechanism, Ireland and Greece will be required to borrow hundreds of millions of euros more in order to send to Portugal. I mean, this is crazy. We're loading debt on debt, and there comes a time when there has to be a reckoning.
Okay, and let's bring that back here now to Linda next. In terms of that picture, do you agree these countries won't see their money back? And do you agree that this is a dangerous way of proceeding? Or is it the only way of proceeding? Otherwise, will these countries sink? And they shouldn't sink, you probably think, do you?
I think it is really tough. In many ways, the single currency, the euro, is a political project. The countries which agreed to join it. I think the problem, though, of course, is once you're in it and these problems arise and they haven't been foreseen, then what do you do about it? And that's the dilemma that faces the likes of Germany, of France. So during the boom years, the first decade of the euro, things were going very well for these countries. They were growing extremely well. Germany, for instance, ran a trade surplus larger than it had before the euro era, and interest rates were very low. But the problem is with the structure of the euro. So, in other words, there are times when countries get into trouble, and normally if you didn't share a currency, an institution like the IMF would step in and try to help you either provide a short-term loan, which is the case now, or in some instances restructure the debt. So the big unknown for the euro project is, how do you manage a debt restructuring without making it a credit default event that could hamper other countries that share the exact same currency that you do? And I think that's the dilemma that's being raised now.
And but do you agree from indeed what Daniel was saying there, that we can't just leave these countries to sink, or we should?
I think it's very difficult for them to do that. Another big unknown is if these countries can't be rescued or helped within the Eurozone themselves, should they leave the Eurozone? There's many economists who think there's two outcomes from the current crisis. The Eurozone becomes smaller, some countries leave, maybe the countries which just find they can't operate sharing a currency with the likes of Germany. But if they leave, what does that imply for the European project? Because they have done well in the first decade. The other extreme is a closer to a fiscal union, tying these countries ever closer together, a little bit like the United States, where you simply have a more fiscal union. They share a lot more taxing and revenue power, but that's a political decision.
Right. Come back here to you, Daniel. Any comment on what Linda just said? And then I've got another question I want to put to you.
Well, I mean, what Linda said is exactly what they're proposing here in the European Parliament and in the Commission. I mean, their solution to the crisis of the euro is fiscal federalism, more pan-European taxation, a European debt union, a European monetary fund, and so on. I mean, you can see the flaw in the logic here. European monetary union has failed, so let's have European economic and fiscal union as well. My dinghy overturned, so please put me at the helm of an ocean liner. The go-kart didn't work very well, so I should now be driving an articulated lorry. Their answer is always more Europe, whatever the question. But I would just go back to this point about helping. Are we helping these countries or are we letting them sink? Look, like most British people, I'm very sentimental about Portugal. They are the only country in our long and bellicose history with Europe that we've never had a quarrel with. If I thought that the way to help them were through a long-term or a short-term bridging loan, there would be a powerful argument to that effect. But Portugal has been pushed into this position not to benefit Portugal, but to benefit the euro. I repeat, the money is going to go to European banks and European bondholders, but the Portuguese taxpayer is going to be resaddled with the repayment.
So do you think, as you look at the situation now, do you think the euro can survive, will survive? You may think it shouldn't survive, but I mean, do you think it can survive?
I think it can, but there will be a price to be paid. I mean, rather than admit to a mistake, the elites of Europe, the Eurocrats, the MEPs, and some of the national governments are sending the bill to their constituents to make it work. The price will be paid in the peripheral countries, in Greece, Portugal, Ireland, who may face a generation of poverty and emigration because they're not able to price themselves into the market. The price will be paid by the taxpayers of the net contributors, who, on top of all the other pressing concerns on their wallets at the moment, are now being saddled with a bill for this. This is not a question of setting one country against another. This is a small European elite saddling all of the peoples of Europe with the costs of refusing to admit that they made a mistake when they launched this project 10 years ago.
So do you think the euro will survive, can survive, should survive?
I think the euro will survive if there is a political will behind it to let it survive. But most economists think that the future look of the euro will be quite different. Either they have fewer members and therefore countries which are more suited to sharing a currency, or they go down this road where they simply have more power centered in the European Union itself. So that does mean countries have to give up more taxing powers and revenue powers to make the project survive. And if you look around the world, the US is probably one of the best examples, is that you can have very economically disparate states that exist. You have very poor states in the United States, very rich ones. You have some bankrupt states in the United States, and you have some which do quite well. But because there's a federal government that redistributes from the center, then it can survive sharing a currency. But that's a big political decision. And I suppose the question now is, especially, do the German taxpayers and does the German government have the will to continue down this road?
And that's a question too, because there are differences of opinion very much there in Germany and so on. But do you think that Greece should default, Linda?
I think that Greece is really struggling with their debt burden. If they can negotiate an extension of their payment terms, that probably would help them a great deal. However, if they were to do that, extend the repayment, there's a high likelihood it would be considered a default event, and it raises more questions about the future of the Eurozone. Sir David, not fewer questions.
Not fewer, but more questions. Well, back to you, Daniel. Would it be healthy if Greece defaulted?
Yes, they should default, decouple, and devalue. They should price themselves back into the market. They should have the economic stimulus of growing under their own steam instead of relying on subventions from elsewhere. I think they have all the advantages once they get cheaper exports of an educated workforce and a good geographical position. What is holding them back and condemning them to this poverty is the euro.
Thank you both. Thank you both very much indeed. That's it for this programme, unfortunately, but my thanks to all of our guests today. Join me again in 7 days' time, please, for another edition of Frost Over the World. Until then, goodbye for now.